This is about the fundamentals of community engaged research. So to emphasize, we'll be talking sort of at a really shallow level about a lot of things today, but rest assured that in follow-up workshops and through some of the readings we'll be giving you, you'll get a deeper sense of some of those topics. So this is kind of like skimming the surface of it today. And I just want to begin with a land acknowledgement. And it's an interesting thing to do a land acknowledgement when people are not gathering in the same place and we're actually scattered across many different territories. I chose to include a photograph of my hometown, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Okanagan Syilx people. And I mention that and I think about that because I can honestly say that in all my time growing up there, and I moved away when I was, I think, 18, and I had never once until about 2 years ago known whose land I grew up on. And I think that speaks to some of the gaps that we have seen in our education system for acknowledging place and history and where we are. So the land acknowledgement is particularly important as part of our decolonizing efforts. And when we're thinking about community engaged research, this becomes of particular importance in thinking about where we're doing the research and making those connections. And I just finished teaching a course on community-based research methods. And for the first time, it was actually my third time teaching that course, but it was my first time having students come up with and practice their own land acknowledgements that were personalized. And when we ask people to do those, a few of the tips that I've gotten from the Indigenous Initiatives team that I have worked with at UBC before is, approaching it with a real sense of humility and trying your best to engage with a sense of vulnerability. And often that vulnerability comes from making a personal connection to a land acknowledgement. And then thinking about new learning and new resources that you might be able to look into. And finally, reflecting on some actions you can take to decolonize the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that because this is deeply connected to the work we'll be doing throughout the CERi Fellows program. And then I just wanted to give you one resource, which is nativeland.ca. The nativeland.ca resource is really great because you can type in the postal code or the location where you are, and it will show you, it will tell you whose traditional lands you're on. And so that works for it's very situated in North America. But I have, been speaking in California before, and I was able to type in the location, and I was able to see whose traditional territory it was. So we've sort of done a little bit of welcome and introductions already. Tara and I were originally maybe co-facilitating together, but I forgot to delete her name out of here because she asked me you don't need to have my name in the facilitator's piece, but I know Tara has been quite involved with everything that you're doing as fellows. So anytime she feels like jumping in and making some of the important connections, she'll be doing that throughout. But yeah, I'm Kari Grain. I wear a few different hats. So I have been teaching on these topics on community engaged research for the past 3 years. At University of British Columbia, and I've been involved with the CERi initiative. I actually connected with Am at a conference years ago, and we are certainly interested in similar areas of community engaged research. And so I've developed a report which we will be sharing with you to have a read through. But I've been working on a literature review, just situating some of what CERi is aiming to do within the broader literature base. So what is community engaged research? The first thing I want to tell you is that everybody will disagree on what the definition of concepts like this is because many people approach it from different angles, right? We're going to be giving you a reading at the end of this to look through, and in that reading, they describe community engaged research as something that creates space for communities, community members, and community-based organizations to work in collaborative partnerships with academic researchers. I would emphasize that CER is a paradigm and an approach. It's not a set of methods. So sometimes I've had students in the past that thought qualitative methods are the same thing as community engaged research. Not so. You can do community engaged research with qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. It's all in how you approach the research, how you deal with like power differences, and how you deal with relationships. So it's very much like a lens through which we view and approach the work. You will probably read a lot about the notion of CER being community-led. There's different language that I see. Some of it's community-led, community-driven, community-centered, in some cases community-based. So all of this is gesturing to the fact that at the center of our work is community, as opposed to something being led by a researcher in an institution. The ideal situation is for it to be led and collaborative with community. Another key aspect of community engaged research is that the positionality of the researcher is questioned, examined, and discussed. And that means thinking about what our biases are, being explicit about what our assumptions are, and realizing where maybe we've been acculturated to certain disciplinary ideas and ideals. And I just wanted to point out, so CERi has developed a set of principles, some key like pillars that they are working through their program. And the first is participation, and then cooperation, empowerment, and knowledge translation. I'm not going to get into what each of those mean, because just participation alone is like a whole area of study. And I think it really gestures to the different ways that you can collaborate with community. I'll point your attention to that picture in the top right-hand side. This is my doctoral research that I did in Uganda in a rural community. And so some of the photos I'll be sharing with you are from my research, and a lot of the community engaged research I've done has been in international communities. And so this is a group of co-researchers, and we did a sort of a longer term, over the course of a year and a half, we did a photo voice project. And this was one of our workshops that we were doing. And as you can see, there's lots of like Fanta and fruit on the table. Snacks were a big part of the work that we were doing. And I won't get into that too much, but I think that setting up situations where people are like breaking bread together and enjoying themselves is a really important way of building relationships together. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. At times I'm having, oh, there we go. Okay, is that the next one? It seemed to switch ahead. There we go. So some of you might be a little confused about the terminology, because I've seen a lot of different terms in the literature that are related. So you can think about many of these terms under the larger umbrella of community engaged research. The first one that comes to mind is participatory action research, or some people also talk about action research. What PAR does is it situates research and education as processes of social transformation. PAR draws on heavily on Paulo Freire's work. So for those of you who don't know him, he was a Brazilian educator and activist, and he really thought that PAR should actually actively disrupt power relations in society. So it is meant to critique the elitism that is sort of wrought in the construction of knowledge that happens through institutions. I'm not going to read this whole quote from Bork 2013, but essentially we want the work of PAR to generate change for the groups that are really affected by the research. And the three requirements or the three pillars you can think about PAR are that it's community-based, that it's action-oriented, and it's collaborative. So we're seeing a lot of overlap with some of the concepts we've already gone through. Another concept or a term that you'll hear a lot is community-based participatory research. And that I have quite a bit of experience with, because I've taught courses that are called this before. And so it represents one end of the spectrum. If you see the words CENR, It's just another acronym. It's the same as CER. It's just that in some papers that they decide to call it center instead of CER. In any case, it represents one end of the spectrum and encourages full participation of community from beginning to end of the research project. So another point that I would add is the ideal that relationships continue on after that research project is done. I'm gonna just move, I'm gonna move on through these slides. If you do have a burning question as we go, please just unmute yourself and say it. Otherwise, I'll try to, oh, go ahead.
When you say that the relationships continue on, do you mean between the researcher and the community, or the relationships that were fostered by the research? So community relationships. Yeah,
so that's a good question. I think that ideally, what we encourage people to think about when they do CBPR is that thinking about it as a longer term relationship. So what we don't want to see is a lot of people, we call it parachuting into a community, getting or doing the research project and then leaving again. So trying the best that you can to consciously work with a community that you think you might continue to be in touch with down the road. And so ideally those relationships with the researcher and the community do continue. It's not always realistic, but it is certainly encouraged. And to your point about the relationships nurtured through the project, that's a really insightful thought, actually, because I think ideally those relationships also continue because of the idea of it being action oriented, that certain things get nurtured through the process of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, I'm going to, sorry, occasionally oh, there we go. Just having technical challenges. Okay. So this is the spectrum. I won't spend a ton of time on this, but in the reading we'll be giving you, there's another visual that describes a bit of a continuum of engagement. So you can see a lot of these different terms that you might read in the literature, all being part of the community engaged research continuum. There are undoubtedly certain studies which don't allow for as thorough of community involvement as we typically like to see, but wherever possible, we like to see research that is more towards the right of this continuum.
Sorry, can I ask one more question?
Sure, yeah, please.
Back on the spectrum,
yeah.
Would you not have to do, like, to get to community-driven research, that you'd have to like know what they want, so you'd have to do an initial like analysis?
Well, the interesting thing about community-driven research is that it's oh, sorry,
that was my partner.
Oh, that's okay. Community-driven research is actually quite rare, because what that means is that the community comes to the researcher and says, we want to investigate this problem, will you help us do it? So what we see more often is something like CBPR, where it's often like some kind of a general inquiry that a researcher has and links up with a community that they know of, or they're already involved with, or that they generate a relationship with. And it becomes more community driven through time, but that true community driven research is when the community actually creates the research question from the get-go. But this is why we say it can actually be quite challenging and not always realistic to be at the far right end of that continuum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on. There we go. Okay. Sorry to bounce everybody around. So we talked about some of the theoretical frameworks or traditions. I can't get into too much depth with this, but one of the things we'll be talking about a lot is just decolonizing research. And this is the idea that research needs to be performative and enmeshed with action and activism. Decolonizing research is also dependent on the researcher constantly being critically aware of power relations, of how the research they're doing might affect the community or affect hegemonic power engagements and inequities. So you always want to be, as a researcher, you always want to be thinking through what could be the impacts of my work on the way that people engage with one another here in this community. Decolonizing research also works within the belief that non-Western knowledge forms are excluded or marginalized in normative research. And I think we see a lot of examples of this. There was, I think last year, no, 2 years ago at UBC, there was somebody who, a PhD student who wanted to submit their dissertation without any punctuation in it. And it became this big thing that was throughout the media, and it was their way of decolonizing academia. So some of those ideas are contained within decolonizing research. Social justice principles, I wanted to draw on this tradition as well because I think it speaks to what we're trying to achieve through CER. Sensoi and D'Angelo, Robin DiAngelo has been getting a lot of press lately because of her work with white fragility. I don't know if you've read any of her work, but she came to SFU last year and she's an amazing speaker. But in any case, she and Sensoi came up with some principles. And 3 of them are here. Actually, I know I only have 2 bullets, but one principle is that social groups are valued differently in society. And the next is that based on the value that those groups are given, they are allocated different resources. So they're allocated more or less resources based on the value. And then a third principle is that to be an advocate of social justice necessarily means that you're critically reflecting on your privilege, on your positionality, and that you are actively thinking about ways to correct some of the inequities in society. So I actually have, I did a screenshot of a publication in the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning from a couple of years ago. And in that, I unpack some of the ways that social justice is enacted through the field of community engagement. But it's something interesting to think about. And this is a photograph of a community partner in a rural area of Costa Rica, and she's teaching these students from University of Calgary. So this is an example of where this work is community-led and community-centered, and the local expertise is really acknowledged. Just going to check timing here. Okay, I have about 6 minutes left for this, and then we'll get into some more conversation. I want to go through some of the benefits of community engaged research. There are a lot, and there are also some challenges and drawbacks, which we'll get into. The first is that there are obvious benefits to you as researchers or those who research within CER frameworks. You can gain real intercultural competence and a better understanding of local knowledges if you don't have them already, if you are not necessarily a part of that community already. And you can enhance the community level support and uptake of your work through doing a CER approach. Now, I think one of the main areas that we're concerned with is what are the benefits for host communities or for the communities you do your research with. The first is that it can generate knowledge and data that a community actually wants or an organization actually wants. It's not just somebody coming in with a question that they want to answer. It can eliminate logistical barriers to participation. So I've often heard of people doing studies and they're trying to get participants to be a part of a focus group, but the focus group is being held at the university and the people they want would somehow need to get all the way to like take the bus or pay for parking. So there's some real logistical barriers that are eliminated when you work within a community. And then for the host communities, they have the opportunity to share their own expertise with a broader audience. I know that was one of the key things that my community partners in Uganda were the most excited about, was sharing some of their own local knowledge with a broader audience. And then This one is really big, and that is the infusion of skills and competencies within a community. So if you're somebody that's highly trained in a certain area and you have a skill set and you are now working for a longer term project, let's say 1 or 2 years with a community organization, if you're doing it right, then some of those skills and competencies you possess are going to be shared, and capacity will be built with people who are in the community or in that organization. And then there is, this one doesn't always get talked about, but I think it's kind of sometimes the elephant in the room if it doesn't get talked about, but that is the economic benefits that host communities see. And this can be locally or internationally. But if you're doing a good job of sharing your privilege and enacting reciprocity, there are usually economic benefits. That should mean that you are, being somebody who supports the local businesses there, somebody who, if you're staying in a community, you're staying at a guest house that is run by a local person. And then just overall, CER can improve research outcomes, and it generates change at multiple levels. I was really happy to hear, who was it? Amin, you were talking about communication with local governments. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things we're talking about, which is that ideally the research actually contributes to change, policy change or grassroots change. It doesn't matter as long as the community is looking for that. Okay, so next we have some of the challenges. My computer keeps taking some time. There we go. So you see what I did here? How this giraffe is really excitedly getting the leaves up top, and then now it's having some challenges with those long legs. So CER often involves some messiness and unpredictability. You will find inevitably that things might not go exactly how you think they're going to. There's no clear roadmap. There are differences in the ways that people know and exist in the world. And when you're working across disciplines or between different realms of society, there will inevitably be different assumptions or ideals that people are working towards. So communication and transparency is so important, and we'll talk about that in the ethics workshop. Often we see a lack of researcher experience or knowledge around community engaged research. So people dive into the work without doing what actually you folks are doing as CERi fellows, which is getting a deep understanding of how to do it ethically before you dive in. Sometimes you see competing accountabilities and conflicting demands. We will talk more about that. Who was talking about that? I can't remember which of you, but one of you is saying you're a part of the community that you're researching. So it's kind of like, there will be times when it's like, am I more of a community member right now, or am I more of a researcher right now? Because my answers or my responses might be different. And then you'll encounter ethical dilemmas. Sometimes if you're working with marginalized communities, there are elevated risks of harm to the community through your research. So thinking through those pieces is very important. CER can also be viewed by traditionalists in some in some disciplines as inferior research, because some people with let's just call it a traditional idea of research, believe that expertise can only be developed through certain avenues and through certain people. And so this really opens up the field of who gets to generate knowledge. And then I just add, sorry, go ahead.
I would just let you know we're at 12 right now.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I think we're close to being done, so I'm just gonna finish these slides. I might go about 2 minutes over.
Okay.
The other thing, the institutional considerations is that if you're doing CER research, it takes more time than a typical research project, because the relationship building and because looping back and checking in is a constant part. And sometimes you have to rejig it altogether based on what the community is looking for. The other thing is that it's rarely, at the institutional level, it's rarely adequately funded, and it's rarely rewarded. So faculty members, for example, a lot of institutions are going through trying to change the tenure and promotion review process, because people who do CER sometimes get punished because you have to put a lot of work into that, and it might mean you don't publish as often because you're working on the relationships instead. So those are some drawbacks. I will now move on. I need to start clicking before I do. There we go. Okay. These are some ethical principles. I'm going to speed through these because we're doing an entire session on ethics. But basically, do no harm through the research. Collaborate with community. There's this quote you might have heard, nothing about us without us. The community needs to be the primary benefactors of what's happening. You should have an action orientation, so being responsive to what the community wants and what the strengths of the community are. There's always considerations of anonymity, privacy, and confidentiality. And then there is, especially with certain professions, there are questions of fidelity and what are your responsibilities as a member of a certain profession. Communication, transparency, and trust is of high importance. Attention to context and place, we talked about that with our land acknowledgements. And then this collaborative analysis and interpretation of the data sometimes actually doesn't get talked about as much as it needs to, but if to the degree that you can, you should include your community partners in the analysis of your data. And then finally, attention to positionality and power. That should always be a consideration. So there we go. We are going to do breakout groups, but I'm just going to make sure that I mention dissemination and celebration. This is a really important part of doing community engaged research, and that is considering how and where the data goes out. This is an example of one of the things my participants in Uganda wanted to do was co-author a paper. They were just so excited at the idea of like being able to be authors of something. And so we published a paper together in the Journal of Experiential Education. And the other thing that they wanted to do was, when I said, well, how do you want to share with a local community? And they wanted to have a dance party and a feast. So Linda Tuai-Smith is a Maori scholar that you might have heard of. And she talks, I saw her speak, and she said, if the dissemination of your research is not a celebration, then you're doing something wrong when you're engaging with community. So I really liked that.